Let's speak to Sadia Hussain now. Sadia is from the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, joined this morning by Ajmal Masroor, who's an imam and a member of the Islamic Society of Britain. Welcome both. Thank you very much for coming in. Obviously, a lot of concern, a lot of hurt over these cartoons. But Sadia, do you think that the protests that we saw over the weekend are in any way justified?
Well, let's look at it. By and large, the Muslim community have protested peacefully with legitimate concerns, and there are deeper roots to this. As we saw on camera just now, the Muslim community is highly aggrieved by this. This was not support for freedom of speech, this was supporting Islamophobia. We saw European newspapers supporting Islamophobia, not standing for freedom of speech, which was the whole issue that covered it up, but they were standing up for Islamophobia.
And I think everybody can understand the anger, but it's whether the anger should have gone into violence, which it did in many of the protests, and also seeing some of the placards which were effectively incitement to murder.
No, sure, absolutely. The placards that we saw this weekend are disgraceful and offensive, and we urge the police to make arrests. The guy dressed up as a suicide bomber, he doesn't represent most Muslims, and he was foolish to do so. He presented a security risk. I'm surprised he wasn't locked up.
Ajmal, what were your views on seeing the demonstrations?
Well, the ones we referred to with the placard, of course I was very disgusted, disgraceful, and police should have arrested them. The guy, is quite surprising, came and apologized for his behavior, which in itself shows how foolish and immature he must have been, and how perhaps he was driven by some of these extreme ideas. What's happened in other parts of the world, such as in, for example, Lebanon and Syria, they have their own political baggage, and they live under a very repressive regime. Any opportunity to vent their anger, not only to local issues, but any issue, communities, of course, jump on the bandwagon. I'm afraid in Islam, it is very clear that what they have done in burning the embassies and flags, they've violated Islamic principle. Sanctity of other people's property is part and parcel of Islamic law. We know that very clearly. But what we cannot ignore is the offence these cartoons have caused. If somebody wanted to create a satire or mock the Prophet, for example, or criticize the Prophet, in a way that is civilized, in a way that creates a debate and a discussion.
Well, how can it ever be civilized? I'm sorry here.
No, let me finish my statement.
If the whole idea, the Danish newspaper wanted to look into the issue about depicting the Prophet, make an image of him, they could have done that through public debate. They could have done that through the written media. But they went way too far. This was a direct insult and demonisation of Muslims.
That's precisely what I was saying. I was saying that if they wanted to create a debate, that's what they haven't done. What they've done is created an outrage. And this is something that the Danish newspapers and anyone else who have done it should be held accountable for.
Yes.
Just one thing I want to add. What they've done is they've depicted the Prophet as a terrorist in their cartoons. Prophet isn't a terrorist, and everyone, even non-Muslim scholars, would say he was a very merciful, kind person.
And I think it's not, obviously it's not just the depiction of the Prophet, which is obviously against your religion anyway,
course, yes.
but the way he was depicted. Understand that, but it's when you're talking about the fact that Islam is a very peaceful religion, which of course it is, I think that the speed with which the protests turned to violence was the thing that...
But you're always going to get extremists who exploit this situation. It's perfect breeding ground for extremists to exploit the situation. You're going to get right-wing BNP people exploiting the situation. We're going to see probably Nick Griffin going back to this issue again. And we're also seeing Muslim extremists coming out, fringe groups.
How do we got ourselves in a bit of a pickle here?
Yes, we
sure.
And both sides have very strong views in it. How do we get ourselves out of it?
I think...
Well, let me ask...
Sorry, the issue here, I think we need greater discussion and honesty in the discussions that we have. Take, for example, what the Danish Prime Minister did when the ambassadors in his country called for a meeting. He refused a meeting, saying, look, I'm not interested in meeting with you. That to us sounds arrogance. I myself was in Denmark, and I saw some of the racist policies Denmark and Danish society have been supporting, especially of the government. We're talking about a group of people who feel marginalized in Denmark, further pushed by some of its existing government's policy. What we want to talk about seriously, especially in the context of Europe, if we want Muslim communities to be equal partner to European experience, we must allow that space. We should not push them, insult them, and constantly belittle that which they consider sacred, and especially not under the guise of freedom of speech.
You're seeing things that are so inflammatory anyway that anything that provokes outrage might lead to this
against
kind of
wisdom.
I'll make it simple. I think we need to go forward by addressing Islamophobia in Europe that exists. We know pockets exist. We need to look at integration of Muslims in these European countries. I'm very happy it didn't happen. The British newspapers didn't publish it. I think we have different integration here in Britain. I think Denmark and other European countries need to look at their integration of Muslims. In fact, if we need to look at the European Convention of Human Rights and make sure that this doesn't happen again and protect these minority communities.